Hi everyone. This video will cover answering the critique, and we're just going to go over the affirmative arguments and some 2AR strategies. And it's recommended that you've already viewed the critique video prior to watching this video. The first affirmative response we're going to go over is framework. Now, frameworks helps define what the debate should center on. And this would occur in the 2AC or the 1AR after it's presented in the 1NC, and you would want an interpretation. And the interpretation is just kind of your explanation of what debate should be. And your argument on the affirmative would be that it's that the plan should be weighed against a disadvantage or a competitive policy option. And a disadvantage to the plan is basically a reason that we should prefer the status quo over doing the plan. And you also need to have reasons to prefer that interpretation. This could be that you lose focus on topic-specific policy education because you're too focused on the assumptions, as that's what the critique is focusing on. So on the affirmative, the app wants to debate about the costs and benefits of implementing the plan, and the negative will argue that they want to focus on the validity of assumptions and reasoning by the affirmative. And that's where that clash on the framework debate happens, and the affirmative introduces that. The next type of affirmative response is a permutation. And similar to a permutation on the counterplan, it kind of tests if the critique alternative can coexist with the affirmative, whether they can happen at the same time. And an example of some permutations is permutation do both, or sometimes they're ordered, like permutation do the affirmative and then do the alternative. And the affirmative, when they're presenting a permutation, they're basically presenting a reason that these two can be done together. And that means that any reasons that their affirmative or the inclusion of their affirmative is good are reasons that you want to prefer the permutation. And so you have to ask yourself, what about the permutation is better than doing the alternative alone? And that's called a net benefit. And that could be the impacts of the AF, for example, or any reasons that the assumptions that you make of the AF are good. The next type of AF response is answering the link. Now, remember, the link is what says the AF assumptions are bad, and that's the negatives argument. The affirmative can respond to it in the following ways. They can say no link. So this is denying the link argument. And you're basically arguing that the plan does not make the bad assumptions that the neg says we're making. And next is a link turn. And now you're saying the assumptions that we're making are actually good and they resolve the impacts of the critique in some way. So these are ways that you can deny and reverse the link argument against the critique. Next is answering the impact. The affirmative can also deny or reverse a negative impact. And when you're saying no impact, you're arguing that the assumptions of the AF does not cause the impacts of the critique. And in an impact turn, you're saying that the impacts that the critique says are bad are actually good. For example, if there's a critique that is saying that the AF is capitalist and it is drilling for oil, that's capitalist and that is bad, the AF response could be capitalism is actually good. It helps people move up economically, things like that. That would be an example of an impact turn. Now, answering the alternative. Similar to the link and impact, you can deny and reverse the alternative. So you can see a trend here. You can deny and reverse different parts of the negative critique. First is that the alternative doesn't solve. And here you just kind of want to prove that the alternative is not good practically or feasibly to solve the impacts of the critique. And that's often a weakness of many critiques. So it's something that you can really focus on. And you can also say that the alternative is a bad idea in some way. Maybe that implementing the alternative will cause a negative impact to occur that should be avoided. Especially critiques that call for more radical alternatives, this is a really good option because they might significantly try to change or want to see major change in society. And that disruption could be a source of maybe a reason that the alternative is a bad idea. Now, when you're going for the critique, you want to focus on one strategy in the 2AR. What I mean by this is that you don't want to go for all the arguments and really spend a lot of time on all the arguments that I just went over, but picking up a general strategy helps the judge organize the decision and kind of set up a decision for the affirmative side. So one major strategy when you're debating the critique is kind of focusing on the permutation and the link arguments. Now, how do these two work together? Because you're answering the link argument, you're weakening the connection between the affirmative and the critique. So it's easier to say that those two coexist together. And link terms, which are saying that your assumptions are good, can act as net benefits to the permutation, because now you're saying the inclusion of the affirmative is actually positive in some way, and we can use the alternative to resolve the other kind of bad impacts of the critique. And that's the best reason to use it, because it helps you utilize the alternative to solve the critique, but you still get to maintain your AF and your AF impacts. And you have to really give a reason why those are important as well. And it's strategic to use this type of strategy when the AF's assumptions don't disagree too much with the critique. So if their link argument is kind of weak, if it's not very specific to the affirmative, this is a good strategy, because it's like, this is only one instance of something that kind of happens a lot. For example, sometimes the link is about taking government action, and government action happens in every affirmative. So sometimes it's a strong argument to use a permutation and link strategy here, because that can be applied many times, but the specifics of your AF is what makes it important to solve. And that's what you should kind of highlight when you're going for this strategy. Now, the next strategy recommendation is focusing on framework and the alternative. So remember, framework is when the affirmative argues that we should focus on the hypothetical costs and benefits of the plan. And that means if you win these types of arguments, you can say that you can leverage your affirmative more, because now it's about whether the affirmative is literally good or bad, not whether the assumptions are good or bad. And now you can really test the feasibility and practicality of the alternative, because it has to be kind of a competing option, not just kind of, they can't just say reject the affirmative's assumptions anymore. They really have to present something to solve the impacts or resolve the impacts of the critique and the affirmative. And why would you use this strategy? Because if by focusing on these hypothetical costs and benefits, you can use your affirmative and directly compare the results of your AF to the impacts of the, or you can directly compare what your affirmative can solve to what the alternative can solve. And if you prove that the alternative can solve very little, that's very good for you in these types of debates. And then you should use this strategy when the AF is more strongly linked to the critique, so your no-link arguments won't be as strong. And instead, you should focus on the reasons the AF is good, and you can maybe even combine this with impact turns, because it's these are all reasons that kind of like the alternative is a worse idea than the affirmative. So lastly, we're just going to go through an example, and the example affirmative presented here is from the last video, and it's the United States federal government should increase military activities and posturing in the South China Seas. And the reason the affirmative gave for this basically is that they want to increase military presence there so they can deter increased Chinese aggression in these areas, and they want to avoid a great power war that could start from miscalculation. The negative critique here is the following. First is the link argument. The affirmative assumes that rising states like China are naturally aggressive, and currently dominant states like the US have to assert this power to stop their violent rise. So it is about kind of the way we view China and the way we view their security, or way we view their incentives related to military security. And we're saying that this type of security logic is bad, because if we view countries as naturally aggressive, always vying for security, we're always going to focus on military funding, and that might take away from other social programs, and it causes us to militarize throughout the globe and places like, and really expand our military presence throughout the globe, which can cause a lot of violence. Next is the alternative, and we should promote new forms of IR, which kind of explains state behavior through different forms, not just security and economics, but through cultural and natural identity. So that is kind of an alternative way to view states instead of always vying for military security all the time. And that is the essence of the critique. On the affirmative side, these are the example responses that some of the example responses that we have just gone over. So first is framework. You would say have your interpretation first, that debate should be about the plan versus the status quo or a competitive policy option. And then you would give the reasons to prefer it. Allowing the negative to question assumptions maybe gives them an unfair advantage and prevents us from learning about the specifics of the policy. Next is the permutation. Permutation do both. So now you're trying to present a way that these can exist together. You can increase militarization in Asia and produce new forms of IR, which do not purely look at states in terms of security. So they're saying we can change our kind of like view of the world, the view of international relations, but that doesn't mean we can't like literally increase our military presence there at the same time. Link turn, our way of viewing the world is good and resolves violence. So now they're saying this is kind of a positive way to view the world, that states are individuals vying for security, and that states are most motivated by security factors, and that means a strong US presence is the best way to influence other countries. So now you're kind of getting to the reasons that the affirmative itself is good. And that's why link turns are really important arguments for the affirmative. And the last argument example I have here is alternative fails. And this is kind of a reason that changing our worldview won't really do much. It won't resolve military tensions, so that you've given specific examples about. And by viewing states as products of social and national identity and not as, we aren't able to analyze them accurately because truly they are vying for security. And that's kind of the affirmative response and why the alternative would fail. So that is a good example of kind of the applications of the arguments that I've already gone over. Now, lastly, these are some tricks to look out for when you're on the affirmative. K teams are going to try to make some like tricky arguments that you should definitely look out for because they're important to answer. First is that the K solves the affirmative's impacts, or it's the prerequisite, which means that you have to do it before the affirmative to solve the affirmative. And that just kind of means that the critique solves something so fundamental, like maybe if they're arguing about, if we go back to our example about capitalism, or that it solves something so fundamental that now there's no, like all the kind of the economic wars that the affirmative is talking about won't happen anymore. Another example is just in our previous slide, in the previous example about Chinese military, if maybe a root cause argument could be, hey, if we didn't have this militarization in the first place, then China wouldn't be aggressive. So you really have to look out for those arguments because they can really subvert the entirety of the affirmative. And another K trick is that the K impact ethically or morally comes before any other impact. So maybe if they say it affects value to life, for example, and value to life is the most important thing, even more than life itself. Those types of things are kind of a trick to get out of debating the impact. And your the last thing is your bad assumptions mean that you cannot solve the F. So basically it's saying that the critique link arguments are so strong and they mean that your F is ineffective in some way. So those are just the quick tricks to look out for. And that's an overview of the different AF answers to the critique. Thank you.